Okay, so let me go ahead and welcome you to our free webinar today on developing custom applications using Power BI Embedded. So what we're going to do is spend the first part of today's webinar just with a quick overview, about 5 minutes of what Power BI Embedded is and what are the things we need to do to be successful developing on top of this Power BI Embedded platform. So along the way, we'll have to talk about working with Power BI Desktop and PBIX project files. We're not going to spend a lot of time there because that's probably one of the more common areas that many people are familiar with. But what gets to be unique to Power BI Embedded is to be able to deal with Microsoft Azure provisioning workspaces, workspace collections. We're also going to have to create a MVC application that has all the different pieces required to embed reports in a custom application. Now, the first part of today's webinar, we're going to deal with PBIX files that are import mode dataset bound, which basically means that the data lives inside of the PBIX file, and as we upload that into Azure, all the data is already there. But we can also work in DirectQuery mode. So at the end, we're going to discuss how DirectQuery mode works, and we're going to talk about the things that you need to do to make that work. And at the very end, we're just going to have a summary to put all the different pieces together. Now, if you're coming to listen to me talk for an hour on Power BI Embedded, you probably have a pretty good idea already of what Power BI is. So it is a cloud-based subscription service. It's an environment that's all about self-service BI and trying to disrupt the industry by creating new ways for new people to create data analytics and reporting solutions that haven't been possible before. And the Power BI platform is just a very new and upcoming way to extract and import your data, analyze it, and to visualize it for you and for other people. Now, one of the big benefits to Power BI is it's all based on cloud services. So typically the users just need a browser. You might need Power BI Desktop, but it's very easy to use and it works very well across platforms such as Windows, Macintosh, and also Unix-based systems. Now, what we're not going to talk about today, but what we have to have a basic understanding of, is how Power BI works for users within an Office 365 organization. Now, for users that have Office 365 licenses and they also have Power BI licenses, well, let me correct myself. You need an Office 365 user account, or basically a user account that's stored in Azure Active Directory, and then that user account has to be configured with a Power BI license. Now, once you have a licensed Office 365 user, you can basically have them access the Power BI service at app.powerbi.com. Now, even though it's app.powerbi.com, Microsoft is referring to this as the PowerBI.com infrastructure. Now, let's compare that to Power BI Embedded. So Power BI Embedded is an Azure service. And as an Azure service, we're able to provision the services we need from Power BI Embedded on demand. Now, when we start provisioning services in Azure for Power BI Embedded, we're going to create these things called workspace collections. And so in order to be able to do this type of provisioning work, either you or someone in your company is going to need to have a Azure subscription, because basically that's the account that we need to be able to provision things inside there. Now, before we get into the weeds, let's just at a high level talk about what is the core value proposition of Power BI Embedded. Compared to what we do over in PowerBI.com, and it eliminates the need for Power BI licenses for each user. So you don't want to cough up the $10 because we have 1,000 users, and we want a more flexible way to pay Microsoft so that we can still get all the benefits of the Power BI platform. It also eliminates the need for your users to have Office 365 accounts. So if you've been creating a web application and your users are stored in your own custom SQL database, or if they use something like Google or any other user repository, you can basically just authenticate your users with whatever repository you want and still tap into Power BI Embedded. So it basically decouples your user security from the application security that's going to download and embed reports. And so basically it opens up the Power BI platform to commercial application development. Because I want to take this app, I want to sell it to lots of people, and I don't want to tell them they all need to have an Office 365 user account and a Power BI license. Okay. Now, let's just quickly do a to B comparison between the two. If your organization is using Power BI and everyone has an Office 365 account and everyone has a Power BI license, you access the Power BI service through https app.powerbi.com. When we use Power BI Embedded, users access your application through whatever URL that you would like to configure for your application. Another problem with PowerBI.com for some scenarios, it requires Office 365 accounts, where Power BI Embedded does not. PowerBI.com requires Power BI licenses, whether it's the free license or the $10 per month license, you have to buy one. And with Power BI Embedded, no user license. Now, what's the big advantage to PowerBI.com? That is, it works out of the box. You don't need any custom development to get up and running. And many organizations will use it without ever doing custom development. Now, when we talk about Power BI Embedded, you can't really get going unless you have developers who are basically building custom web applications and we want to embed Power BI reports and dashboard tiles inside of them. Now, with PowerBI.com, you don't need an Azure subscription because there's nothing to create in Azure. But once we start using Power BI Embedded, you are going to need to have a Azure subscription. Okay, now what's the big picture? The big picture is that you're going to start the same way whether you were targeting PowerBI.com or you're targeting Power BI Embedded. You're going to basically create a Power BI desktop project. So basically it's a PBIX project file. Now we do that using Power BI Desktop. And as much as Microsoft is trying to make more and more things available across platforms to Macintosh and Linux users, Power BI Desktop is a bit of a sore thumb because it was developed using the .NET framework. So currently, Power BI Desktop only runs on Windows machines. Okay. After or at the same time that we're working on the PBIX project files, we're going to go into Microsoft Azure, we're going to have a subscription, and we're going to start provisioning the services we need for Power BI Embedded. And we're going to basically create a workspace collection, and inside there, we're going to start creating workspaces. Okay. After we've created the workspace, which is the target, we're going to upload a PBIX project file to that workspace. Now, we're going to be able to do this with PowerShell or with something called the PowerBI-CLI, or with the Azure REST API. I'm going to show a bunch of sample code, and some of this I'm going to show you, doing it all three ways before we get to the end of this hour. And then finally, once you've created the workspace and you've uploaded the PBIX project file into that workspace, the last part is to develop a web application that has the code required to embed Power BI reports inside of it. And as you're going to see along the way, this is going to be most easily accomplished by using ASP.NET MVC. Now, our next section is working with PBIX project files. So once again, if you've been using Power BI for a while, that's probably the first thing you got up to speed on. But for those of you who haven't worked with Power BI Desktop before, let me give you a brief rundown. So there's this tool which is called Power BI Desktop, and it's Microsoft's primary design tool for building reporting and data analytics solutions for the Power BI platform. The idea is you have this tool that loads onto your desktop that can pull data from across the internet or anywhere across the network and create a local cache of data. And then you can take the data set, continue to model the data set, and then you basically have a report designer inside there. So the idea is queries and data modeling and report design is all done by users that might not be developers, and they package them up in these PBX projects As far as the developer is concerned, many developers will just look at these PBIX project files as black boxes. These are things that I didn't work on, but I'm going to take and embed inside of my web application. So one of the things that's also nice about Power BI Embedded is the forced separation of all your query / data modeling / report activities, which is totally separated from anything you do as far as creating an application that's going to host those reports inside there. And so what will be common is that you'll have one team building the PBIX project files and another team that basically is embedding them using MVC web applications. Okay. Now, what is inside of a PBIX project file? Now, inside of the demos that we're going to look at today, there's 3 demos that we're going to look at. And the first one we're going to look at is Northwind Retrospective. Now, some of you might be as old as me and remember back in the 90s when Microsoft had things like Access databases and SQL databases. And what was the big, cool database sample? It was Northwind. Now, the reason I chose Northwind, here I am, I've just opened up this Power BI desktop project. Let me go ahead and open up the queries inside here. And so what you're going to see is I have several different queries, but all these queries come from this one particular data source. And the data source is just at services.org v3 Northwind. So it's just basically sample data that you can pull in via web service that's available over the internet with anonymous access. So the idea is I have a bunch of queries here. Let me go ahead and close this. And anytime I click on refresh, it's going to go and pull the fresh data. Now, of course, Northwind data hasn't changed in 20 years, so refreshing is not going to do a lot for me for the demo. But you can see that we have data sources. We have a particular set of queries that are going to run. The queries go to building some type of a data model. And once the queries output the tables into the data model, well, then you can use the data modeling features. For example, let's go over and here's an example of a calendar table that I built with DAX. If I look down at the customers table inside here, you can see things like we've created hierarchies. We've created some calculated fields. If I look at the sales table inside here, we have some measures. Now, let's go ahead and look at our report design inside here. So once we start designing reports, we have things like maps. We have the ability to run filters. This is just a slicer control that I have inside there. And note that inside of a project file, we have different pages. So every PBIX project contains exactly one data model that typically has to have at least one table, but could have many tables. And then it has a single report, and that report can have many different pages inside there. Okay, so the idea is that someone would have to have built some type of a project file like this. Let's go ahead and close that down. Also note that I'll tell you again at the end where this is, but there is a GitHub repository that I've created that has all the sample code and all the PBIX projects inside there. Okay, once again, it's just up in our Critical Path Training GitHub repository. I'll give you the URL at the end, but I see a couple people asked, are we going to get the slides? Are we going to get the sample code? It's all there for you in this repository. Okay, now back here, what is inside the PBIX project file? Well, it contains data source definitions that might point to, in our case, a web service across the internet, might point to a on-premises SQL box or an Azure SQL database. It contains query definitions. It contains a data model and exactly one report. And one other thing to note is that in Power BI, the PBIX project file will never contain any type of credentials such as a username or password. When you're using Power BI Desktop and you add the username and password to connect to SQL, it stores them in a separate file outside of the PBIX project file. And whenever we upload the PBIX file to something like the Power BI service or to Power BI Embedded, we're always going to have to go and configure those login credentials afterwards. Okay, so now you've seen those. We've seen Northwind, and now we have basically something that we can work with inside there. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to move on to is to provision workspaces inside of Microsoft Azure. So what we're going to need to do is create a Power BI workspace collection. Now let me go back inside the browser. Let me go back and log into Azure. And inside of Azure, we have, first of all, these things called resource groups. For those of you who are new to Azure, Azure has an older infrastructure, which we kind of call the Azure Service Management Infrastructure. And a couple of years back, they changed things drastically and moved over to something called ARM, or the Azure Resource Manager. And one of the big changes that we got is that now all the resources or all the services we create get created in these buckets that are called resource groups. It just makes it a lot easier to manage a set of services. So let's say that I create a new resource group, and I'll just call this one Demo 1, and we'll go ahead, we'll choose Create. Once I've created that particular resource group inside there, well, now I can say Add, and I can say Power BI. And once I get Power BI inside there, you know, what we should see is one of the types of services that I can create is Power BI Embedded. Now, when you go ahead and provision this service, here I'm doing it by hand. In just a second, I'm going to show you that all this can be automated with PowerShell or with C#. So what you're going to see here is I go ahead and I create this new particular workspace inside there. It makes me enter a name. So if I call it Workspace Collection 1, and I put it inside of my particular resource group inside there, and let's come up with a name that is unique inside there. I want to use the free trial. Notice that there's a pricing tier. Today there's only one pricing tier for S1 standard, but let's go ahead and choose Create. So once I've created this, let's go ahead and take a quick look at it after the fact. And so what we're going to see here is if I go to my resource group, Demo, and now we go ahead and find the workspace collection that I just created. Let's go ahead and click on that. And so the most important thing that I want to show you is that it's going to have workspaces inside there. Note that there's nothing you can do through this portal to create workspaces. You're going to have to figure out how to do that via PowerShell or C#. But there are access keys. So the idea is that your application doesn't authenticate the user and pass the user's identity in. Instead, your application is going to use these access keys inside there. And the idea is you're going to grab the access key, and that's going to allow your application to get access tokens inside there. Okay, now that you've seen that, let's go ahead and move over to something a little bit different. And inside of our sample project code, let me go ahead and move over to that inside there. I'm going to open up this Create Workspace collection inside here. And so now that we see this inside here, note that I've kind of hidden my password so you can't see it, but we're creating some credentials inside. Once we do that, we're going to log into Azure. And the way that we do that is by calling login Azure RM account. And so here, let's say that we need a name of a resource group. So let's call this one Demo 2. And so our code right here is going to see, is there already a resource group named Demo 2? If not, it's going to create it. Next, we have a commandlet, which is part of the Power BI commandlets. So basically, there is an extra library of commandlets for Power BI that you can install. Up at the very top here, I have commented out, here's the code that you can run to make these commandlets available on your machine. You know, but the idea is I can create a workspace collection inside here. And once we create a new workspace collection, Why don't I call that wingtip sales 2? Let's go ahead and run the script right here. And as I start running this script, you can see that my code can figure out what resource group I want. I can either connect to the resource group or create it if it's not there. We create the workspace connection inside there. After this is all said and done, let's go back and refresh. And so there's the resource group we just created. If I drill inside there, hey, here is the workspace collection. I drill inside there and we don't have a workspace yet, but we do have a workspace collection. Okay, also note that if we look at the bottom of this script, let's go ahead and note that once you've created the workspace collection, you're assumed to be the owner, and if you want to grab the keys programmatically, you can do that as well. So here's an example of grabbing that key, and the idea is that this key is important. This key is something that you're going to need inside of your code quite often. You're copying and pasting this, or you're acquiring it in the PowerShell script and then turning around and using it inside the PowerShell script. Now, as I keep going down here, notice that we can get workspaces. And one problem with the PowerShell commandlets is that while you can create a workspace collection and you can look for workspaces, you can't actually create a workspace. So what's the story there? Well, now what I just showed you is that there's a little bit of a non sequitur, sorry about that. Back in the slides, you can basically create workspace collections by hand, or you can do them with PowerShell. Now there's one more utility I'm about to bring into the picture, which is called the PowerBI-CLI. And that's the thing that we're going to need to actually create the workspaces inside there. Later, I'm going to show you how you can do the same thing with C# and some of the NuGet packages for the PowerBI APIs that we can use in a C# application. Okay. Now also, I pointed out that a workspace collection has access keys. The idea is you have 2 keys, so you don't hand out the first one. You can hand out the second one, and then if the key gets compromised, you can change it. But as long as you always have 1 key, you can get inside there. Now, what we just looked at was using the PowerShell commandlets for PowerBI embedded, and they allow you to create workspace collections. You can also see if there's any workspaces, but it doesn't allow you to actually create a workspace. So there is a second tool that we're going to bring into the picture. And this tool is the PowerBI-CLI. The CLI is a command line utility for Power BI. Now, if I go to this one particular place in GitHub, note that, let's go ahead and click on this. Note that this tool is maintained inside of GitHub. Note that when you want to install this thing, you have to use something which is called Node Package Manager. So I know some of you developers have moved over and started working with Node.js and Node Package Manager, but if you haven't, you have to figure out how to install Node.js. So you have Node Package Manager, and then you can install the Power BI command line instruction tool from there. Now, a nice thing about the Power BI CLI, it's supported on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And the idea is that some people might actually sit at the console and type commands in to, update or upload PBIX files in a production environment. Now, this tool can be accessed just using the command prompt. So, for instance, once you install this, if I just go to the command prompt and type Power BI space and add one of the supported commands, we can go ahead and get this thing running. Now, one of the problems with Power BI CLI is it can be driven from PowerShell, but it doesn't give you back nice, clean data. It gives you back messages, and so doing things like running something and grabbing the GUID out afterwards, gets to be a bit challenging. But let's go ahead and see the big picture. So what's nice about this is we can use it from PowerShell. So let's go back, and now we're going to look at the second example. And this is going to be import into PBIX project inside there. Okay, I think I just gave away my password. I'll have to change that after the session today. But now what I want to do in this example is let's go ahead and create another one. So this resource group we'll call Demo 3. And for this particular case right here, we'll have the workspace collection called Demo 3 as well. Let's go ahead and run this right here. Let's go ahead and run it, see the result, and then we'll take a look at the code. Okay, so basically the workspace collection is not creating it because there's a conflict in the name. So let me go ahead and just make these names unique. You can tell it's an on-the-fly demo. Let me go one more point and put that inside there. And now we'll run it one more time. Okay, so what I want to show with this one is that we're going to create a workspace because we need the workspace to be able to upload a PBIX project file, and we're going to upload that as well. Now, let's go back. Let's look at my resource groups. Here's the one that I just created right here. Notice that here is my Power BI workspace collection, and then here's my workspace. Now, what you will want, but what you cannot have, is for your workspaces to have nice, friendly names. When a workspace gets created, it's a GUID, and that is pretty much it. There's no way to add a name or any other ID property unless you want to use the tags facility in Azure, where you can just take any type of provisioned object and add tags to it. Okay. Now, also from this tool, we can't really look inside and see what's inside there. But now, let's go back here to the PowerShell script and kind of step through, how this worked. So what we did is we created a workspace collection, and once we had the workspace collection, we're going to see if we have any workspaces. And while the PowerShell will let you query to see if there's workspaces, it doesn't let you create them. Okay, so notice that here we're going to look for workspaces. If there are workspaces, we're going to call PowerBI create workspace. We have to pass the name of the workspace collection. We have to pass the access key, but basically that call right here, is what actually creates the workspace. Now, once we've created the workspace, the next thing we need to do is to upload a PBIX file. So once again, we're going to call PBI import, and here's my workspace collection. Here's my access key. Here is the workspace. So remember, with workspaces, you always have to grab the GUID. And what's funky is that, notice that when I get my workspaces back and I take the first workspace, it's not an ID, it's a .name. Okay. I don't think I would have made it so that a field that holds a GUID would be called name, not ID, but that is the way that things worked out inside there. Okay, but once you pass the GUID to the workspace, the PBIX project file, and then also the report name. Now here's another thing that can be confusing. When you upload a PBIX file, it has both a dataset and a report. So you give it a friendly string name, and that becomes the report name. It also becomes the dataset ID, and sometimes they call it the report ID. Okay, so last thing here, I'm not going to use this in my example, but just as a for instance, let's say that I wanted to create the embed token. This tool also gives me the ability to create the embed token inside here. Note that when I run these, I call Power BI, I then get the result, and I can just write the result out, and you can kind of see what it looks like inside the window right here. Okay, here's an embed token. I'm not going to use that, but you kind of get a basic idea, of what this particular script does. Okay, so let's keep going. Question is, am I going to share the PowerShell? Yeah, the PowerShell is just up inside of the site. So once again, if I go back to this Power BI embedded GitHub repository I've created for this, and I go to PowerShell, the things that I've created for you, are available right there for you to see. So everything I've done here is going to be available to everybody. Okay, let's keep going. So now that we've talked about provisioning workspaces in Azure and we've got our PBIX file up in the cloud, well, our next step is to embed a report or embed the report from that PBIX file into a web application. Now, we're going to use an MVC style application. Now, at the end of the day, when you think of how are Power BI reports embedded, the underlying mechanism they use is an iframe. They basically add an iframe into your page, and the iframe has a source that points to a URL up in embedded.powerbi.com, and it also has the app token inside there, and basically it's got the report ID of the report that it wants to pull down from inside. Now, you're typically not going to have to build the iframe. We're going to use some server-side C# code that's going to create a div that looks just like that div there without the iframe. Then we're going to use a JavaScript library by Microsoft, which is the PowerBI JavaScript API, and we're going to use that to automatically generate this iframe for us. Okay. Now, we're going to create a MVC application. I guess one thing to point out is as I go through and I show you how to embed reports into a custom web application from Power BI, that's a common thing that we're going to do with Power BI Embedded. In fact, it's the only thing we're really going to use Power BI Embedded for. It's also something that you could do with PBIX files that are uploaded into PowerBI.com. The big difference there is that when we use Power BI Embedded, our application has an app level security token, and so it's not different for each user. Okay. When we connect to PowerBI.com, typically authentication is different because you authenticate the user, and you have to somehow pass a security token that identifies the user and allows PowerBI.com to match that up to an Office 365 user account with a license. Now, because we have this application level key, typically you can't go with a complete client-side SPA application because then you'd be taking the secret, your key, and pushing it back and forth through the browser. So typically you need a server-side, or what in terms of OAuth we call a confidential client, not a public client. Now, with an MVC application, you're going to add these 4 NuGet packages. So there's the Power BI Core, there's the Power BI API. You can think of these two as just .NET productivity wrappers around the Power BI REST API. There's also going to be an MVC component, which is going to allow us to generate the divs that are required. And then there's also going to be the Power BI JavaScript library. Okay. Now, with these APIs, let's look at the core and the API first. When you look at Microsoft.PowerBI.core, that's really nothing other than security management. So they have a Power BI token class, and we might use that directly, or that might be used behind the scenes. The things that we're going to program against are the types that we find inside of Microsoft.PowerBI.API. Note that everything we're using these days is scoped inside of a namespace that has V1. The idea is that they can release V2, make big changes without breaking any of our code. But what you're going to see is that when you look at the API.V1, you have things like datasets and imports. The idea of an import is if you take a PBIX file and you upload it, that's an import. Okay, and within the PBIX file, there's reports and there's datasets, there's workspaces. So this is the code that I'm going to show later, which is going to allow us to replace the PowerShell code for provisioning with C# code for provisioning. And then also there's v1.models, and this has generally types that are used to convert .NET objects into JSON to move them back and forth. Okay, now there's also some MVC Helper Classes, and there's report extensions and token extensions. So when you look at report extensions, you have things like Power BI Report and Power BI Report 4. When you look at the token extensions, you have Power BI Access Token and Power BI Access Token 4. And the idea of these MVC helpers is that when you're working with a Razor view, just like you can say at html.action link, you can also say at html.powerbi access token. And the idea is that when you add this MVC helper inside there, it will take your access token, it will reach across the network and get the embed token and add that inside of the report. So generally, these MVC helper classes expand what you've done in your HTML, into something that contains a lot more JavaScript and possibly other configuration data. Okay, now the Power BI JavaScript API, this guy gets to be incredibly powerful. And so we're going to use this to complement all the server-side work that we've done. Now, if I spin back a couple pages right here, and I go back to this, what's going to happen is if you get rid of the iframe and just leave the div, that is the part that the MVC helper class will create for you. And the idea is that once all that data is on the page, now we'll go back here and get to this piece of code right here. What you're going to see here is that when I call PowerBI embed and I pass it the right information, it's going to basically do the work to create that iframe and automatically create the binding inside there. Now, when you create one of these embeds, what's going to happen is it's going to return a report object. And so that report object is something that allows me to do things like capture events. And what we're going to see is there's things like the report has been loaded event and the page in the report has been changed event. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this particular demo that's going to show us, how to put all these different pieces together. Okay, so let's go ahead and move over to Visual Studio. And that is the provisioning demo. We're going to move over here instead, and we're going to look at this one, which is Hello PBI Embedded. Now, with this application, what I wanted to do is really just kind of give you the minimal amount of code to make things work inside there. So let's go ahead and start by opening up the web.config file. Note that Microsoft has a sample, and this is very much like the Microsoft sample, but I tried to reduce complexity wherever I could. The Microsoft sample does a couple cool things with MVC and puts things into separate controllers. But to me, that was blurring. Is this a cool MVC application, or is it really just the Hello World sample with Power BI embedded? So I wanted to do it all within a single controller. Okay, so let's look at the home controller right here. Now, what's going to happen is the home controller, it's a single page application basically. When we run this right here, one of the things that we need to do is we need to embed a report inside there. Now, the way that things are going to work is that when this controller action method runs, well, first thing we want to do is get token credentials. So once again, that app key is very important. The app key is something that you put typically inside of your web.config file, and the idea is that that is the secret your application has, and it uses it to create tokens. Now, the tokens we actually put on the page are not going to be the same type of tokens. They're far less privileged tokens. So think of this one as your developer credential or your Azure credential. And what's going to happen is we're going to use this credential to be able to create things inside there. Now, there is a Power BI client, which is part of the API. You'll create it. Now, the next thing we're going to do is say reports.getReportsAsync. We pass it the workspace collection and the workspace ID. So also note inside here that we need the workspace ID of the thing that we're going to be looking at inside there. and we need the workspace collection. And once we have that information inside there, back here, we're going to be able to get back a list of the reports, and we're going to be able to find the one report that we really care about. And then also, here's where we're going to create the embed token. Power BI token.create embed token. And so the idea here is that since you have your access key, you're privileged, and you can create these less privileged embed tokens inside there. Now, next piece that we're going to have right here is once we've got this, there's really two things. There is the report object. Note that this report object that we have inside there, let me go ahead and stop for 1 second, because if I show you this report object inside and we do a report dot, note that this is the object from the Power BI object model. So once I get the report back from the API, I can find the embed URL, the ID, the name, or the web URL inside there. So we can basically find the report ID. Okay, now the other piece that's important here is that I'm going to take some data and I'm going to pass it to my view. So I've created a report view model inside here. And the idea is, what two pieces of information do we need inside of the view? Well, we need that report object that has things like the ID and the embed URL, and we need to have the access token. And remember, this is the embed token inside there. So the idea here is that we can now take this view model that has both the report and the access token, and we can pass that into our view. Okay, let's go ahead, take a look at the view inside here. And if we look at the view, don't worry about what's in the toolbar. Let's just look what's down here. And the idea is we're going to say HTML Power BI 4. Now, because we're passing in that report view model, that's my own custom class to be able to pass data from the controller into the view here, we're able to say model.report and model.access token. And basically, that's going to create the div that has that information inside of it. Now, the next piece, let's go down and take a look at the shared view here, because the shared view is where we're going to add the Power BI API, the Power BI JavaScript client-side API, and then there's going to be my code inside there. Okay, so note that we have PowerBI.js and we have my app code. Let's go ahead and take a look at my app code inside there. So if I go to scripts and we go to app.js, well, basically what's going to happen is we're going to run this code. So I didn't want to use Angular or Angular 2. I just wanted to do it kind of down and dirty. So I'm using jQuery here. But what you can see is that PowerBI.embed is what gives us our embedding. Okay, let's run this one more time. So you can start seeing how the client-side API gives you a very useful object model. Okay, once this thing loads in here, you can see that, there's my report. I have some code that basically responds to the load event and loads all the pages inside here. Note that in this case right here, while I could show the filter object or I could show the page navigation, we've decided to leave those out and instead create our own page navigation scheme over on the left-hand side. Now, let's go ahead and see how this JavaScript code makes all those pieces work. So inside of this code right here, let's go ahead and focus on, you just create a report, and now once you've created that embedded report, what they call an embed, you can hook into events. So if I call report on loaded, every time that a report finishes loading and it's time for me to run my initialization code, I can basically tap inside there. So let's look at this piece of code right here. So when the report gets loaded, we're going to say report.getPages. That's going to return back a collection of all the different pages. And so I have a page navigation URL, and here I am just basically using jQuery to create a div and an input button with a radio tag, and then we're going to hook up events. And so when someone clicks on one of these, we're going to basically say, find that particular page and set it as the active page. And so what we can see here is that now I've gotten this navigation scheme, so we can kind of move through all the different pages in our report. I can even make it, such that we can basically have the user arbitrarily move through. Now, if I show navigation, I think what you might find is that the navigation that's built into Power BI reporting is pretty clunky compared to what you can do. So you might decide, once again, let's go back here, and in the report config, we're going to say set the filter panel enabled false and the nav content false, and that basically embeds my report without those elements inside there. Okay. There's also a page changed event handler right here. And one of the things that I want to show you is that here we can change things and move from page to page. But what if, let's go ahead and show the filter. And now let's start changing pages from this view. Notice that this is keeping in sync right here. So we have the event handling that is able to do that for us. One other thing that the API is really good at, but I haven't included in my demonstrations today, is the ability to run filtering at either the page or the report level. So if you want to build your own user experience that allows users to select filter criteria, the JavaScript code outside the report can push the filtering information into the report. And once again, that can make for a pretty nice experience as well. Okay, let's go ahead and return back. So what I wanted to do with that first demo is just kind of show you, how all the different pieces fit together. And I think if you just open up that HelloPowerBIEmbedded project, and you might have to plug in a couple things and create your own workspace collections and upload a PBIX file, but you should be able to get things working pretty easily inside there. Okay, now next thing I want to do is look at DirectQuery mode. Now let me go and I'm going to close this demo, and with this demo closed, I'm going to move over to another project. And the second project I have, I wasn't worrying about making it as simple, but making it probably a little bit more interesting and useful. So when I look at this second page right here, let me go ahead and close this down and run this right here. What I want you to see with this particular project is that I tried to create something that is a lot like the Power BI service, but the idea is that we open up this particular project, and then you can see the different reports that are inside of your current workspace. And if you click on one of those, it's basically going to load in the report inside there. And once again, as I pick one of these things inside there, notice that here it doesn't show anything, but when the report load comes in, well, then I can do things like put the configuration and the filter pane back in, the exact same idea that we can switch back and forth between pages, but now we've just kind of added the ability to pick whatever projects or whatever data sets, or remember, is it a data set or is it a report? It's the same thing. It's a PBIX project file. So each one of these kind of represents one upload. One other little tidbit is that when you import a PBIX project file and you want to overwrite the earlier one, there's no overwrite. Even if it has the same name, it just creates a new one inside there. So typically you're going to have to write code to do a delete followed by another import inside there. Okay, now let's go back, and the next thing we're going to talk about is DirectQuery mode. Now, what we often work with in Power BI, both in Power BI Embedded and over in the PowerBI.com infrastructure, is PBIX projects with imported data sets. And the idea is you pull a bunch of data down to your local desktop. It gets stored inside of your PBIX project file. When you're all done, you upload the PBIX project file, and the data goes with it. And whenever someone uses reports, it's able to take the data set that's been uploaded and basically just load it into memory inside the cloud. Now, one of the issues is that the PBIX files are limited at 1 gigabyte. Now, because of the tabular database format and the way they compress columns, quite often you can get data models that have hundreds of millions of rows into that 1 gigabyte limitation. But sometimes your data is just too big and can't fit inside there. Another problem with the imported model is that the data set needs to be refreshed whenever the source changes. Now, inside of PowerBI.com, you can go to the datasets and configure them to either refresh on demand or to refresh at a scheduled periodic interval. Bad news with Power BI Embedded, and that is there is no importing mechanism. So if you're working with the imported model and your data changes, the only way to deal with that is open up the PBIX project file, run a refresh to get the new data in, delete the old PBIX project file you imported yesterday, and import the one that has the new data inside there. Now, what's the alternative? We can also use something which is called DirectQuery mode. And the idea with DirectQuery mode is that there is no data that is imported or cached into the Power BI cloud. Instead, reports and data sets, when they need data, they basically just query a live connection. So there's no need to worry about data refresh because you're always querying against the live data. There's no need to worry about the 1 gigabyte size limitation. And generally, your PBIX files are going to be tiny because they don't have any data inside them. Okay. Now, one thing to note is there are, many different limitations that are placed when you're working with DirectQuery mode. Let me go back and open up. If I go to PBIX project, there's one which is Wingtip Sales DirectQuery. So when you are in DirectQuery mode, what you will find is that while it's powerful, you've got a dashboard that has, its hand right into the live information. But the problem that we have is that there's a lot of things that you can do in import mode that you can't do in DirectQuery mode. First thing you realize is you look over here and your data view is gone. You have relationship view, you have design view. And so what you'll find is, let's go ahead and take a query. And I take one of these particular queries and I look at this data inside there and I say, okay, let's take that, convert that into a whole number. And all of a sudden you find out that's not supported in DirectQuery mode. I tried to add a calculated column, not supported in DirectQuery mode. So there are many things that you cannot do in DirectQuery mode that you can do in import mode. Okay. That being said, there's still plenty of things that you can do inside here. For instance, in our example right here, there is a couple tables in a Azure SQL database inside there. And we can do things, such as use geographic metadata. We can still create things, such as measures. So basically you create measures, but not calculated columns. And there are some measures where if you write code, Microsoft will disallow it by default because it will basically say that there's too much potential for non-performant behavior. If I go down to options, settings, and we bring this up inside here, what we're going to find under DirectQuery mode is that if you want to be able to write any type of DAX you want in a measure, you're going to have to click on that, shut down and restart Power BI Desktop. Okay, now with all that, let's go ahead and talk about what types of data sources are supported for DirectQuery. And here's the list that Microsoft has, and basically it's only relational database management systems. Okay, so we have the usual suspects: SQL Server, Azure SQL, SQL Analysis Services, and then many of the other big relational database management systems Microsoft's bringing online with DirectQuery. But we don't support anything like online services. So DirectQuery mode is only available for certain types of data sources. Note that DirectQuery mode imposes the limitations. All tables have to come from a single database. Many types of query steps aren't supported. Something such as converting a type is not supported. Relationship filtering only goes in one direction. Many of the time intelligence capabilities are not available because you can't create a calendar table with DAX. If you had a calendar table in the database you were pulling things from, you can work with that and get some time intelligence. No special treatment for date columns, so it doesn't give you things like the built-in date hierarchy. No calculated columns, and the limitations placed on DAX measures. Okay. Now, the main problem that we have is that Power BI Embedded, once you upload a PBIX file, doesn't support refresh. So when you have data that's constantly changing and you want to get rid of the headache of having to upload new PBIX files, DirectQuery is really the only way to go. Now, one last thing we're going to look at, and that is one more application. And this one, I'm going to move over and we're going to open it up, and it is the Power BI provisioning. Let's go ahead and open this up inside here. Now, what you're going to see with this, let's go ahead, open this up. So I have a lot of information inside here about subscription ID, the user ID. So basically this is an application that is going to connect to Azure as me and give me a developer token so I can do things like provision new workspace collections. Okay. So when I'm writing C# code, here's some code just using the Active Directory Authentication Library to get a simple access token inside there. And as I look down here at some of the different functions that we have, there's getting resource groups, creating resource groups. So this is going to do a lot of things that the PowerShell example showed you, except when we get down here to do the import. Let's go ahead and look at the import right here. So notice that there is this thing which is the Power BI client. And the idea is that I just have a little utility method here to get the Power BI client. And the idea is that if you get your workspace collection key, you get the token credentials, you can create a new Power BI client. You have to give it the base URL of app.powerbi.com, but now you have the Power BI client and you can start programming against it. So in our case right here, we're able to say client.dataset. No, sorry, let me go down to the import the PBIX file. So in this case right here, when I want to import a PBIX file, we have client.imports. So once again, this is just the Power BI C# or .NET API. Post import with file async. I'm able to add that inside there. Here's a little code that's going to wait. But then the other piece that gets to be important is that when you use Direct Connect and you're basically accessing data from a database, you need to have credentials that are stored inside there, and the credentials can never be stored inside of the PBIX file. So here's some code that's going to create a Power BI client. It then is going to look at the data sets in your workspace. Once we've got those inside there, we're going to loop through the data sets. We're going to find the data set that we want. And in particular, a data set has a data source behind it. So here we get the data sources. And inside of this particular project, when you're using Direct Connect, you typically have only one data source. So we have to create this gateway data source, set the credentials, and then we're able to basically give the Azure SQL name and username, and then finally call gateways patch data source. So once you've uploaded the PBIX file, a second step is then to go and configure the username and password, so when Power BI tries to reach across the network into Azure SQL, it's going to be able to make a connection. Okay, gosh, that's a lot of stuff. We're a couple minutes over already. Let me just kind of one more time, what really threw me off was at first having the idea that when you import a PBIX file, you have both a data set and a report. and they keep asking you for the dataset ID, the report name. It's all the same thing. When you upload the PBIX file, you're creating a dataset and a report pair, and you give them a friendly string name. Okay, and there's that code that we just walked through inside there. Now, let's just kind of end by saying, with Power BI embedded, one of the nice things that Microsoft has done is to say, you're in charge of authenticating your users and determining where your user accounts are stored. We don't want to get into that business. So with Power BI embedded, it really kind of expects you to perform all the necessary user authentication. And once the user has authenticated, you also have to have some type of an authorization scheme, to make sure that users are only seeing reports that they should. Note that Power BI supports row-level security in PowerBI.com. It also supports row-level security in Power BI embedded. So when you create an embed token, you can pass a role. And the idea is, if in your PBIX project you create 3 different roles for East Coast sales and Central sales and Western sales, and then you have row-level security configuration such that each one of those roles has criteria to only see certain rows in the customers table. Well, the idea is that when you get an embed token, you can put the role inside there, and your embed token will have the role inside. And the idea is that Power BI Embedded will only show that user data they have access to see. Okay, finishing up, I know that you've been waiting to the very end, so I can tell you about our training. We have a Power BI Developer Boot Camp at Critical Path Training. So audiences, professional developers will teach you creating custom visuals with TypeScript and the D3.js library. We'll teach you about programming R, integrating R with Power BI, programming with the Power BI REST API, and developing Power BI Embedded, very much like we were just covering in the session. We have a earlier course, and this is one Power BI Bootcamp. Just doesn't have developer in the title. And the audience is business users, data professionals, and it's really about working with Power BI Desktop, getting very used to the query design, data modeling, report designs, and also working with group workspaces, organizational content packs, and learning more about working with Excel, what it is to import a workbook into Power BI versus connect to a workbook in Power BI. Okay, so with that, we got to the very end here. There was a lot of stuff there. Let me go ahead and, since everyone was very good, waited to the end, if I go and I take a look at this GitHub repository and go ahead and show you this URL right here, what you can see is that all my code and the slides are available at this URL. So you want to download this, you want to run the PowerShell scripts, kick the tires. I'm certainly hoping that everyone can use this information. Okay. So a couple questions in the question panel. I'll go ahead and ask those. Probably just got a couple more minutes right here. So we have a question from Daniel. DirectQuery works against Azure SQL Server, right? Yes, that's the one I was demoing. So that one definitely works inside there. So DirectQuery now is working with cloud-based data sources. What Microsoft is kind of working to get is to also have a conduit so they can make Power BI work with on-premise data sources, and that's still to some degree a work in progress. Okay, what version of Microsoft Visual Studio is needed? I would say Visual Studio 2015 with the latest updates inside there. So I can't say my project is going to work out of the box with Visual Studio 2013. If you have the 2017 release candidate, that will be fine. Okay, here's another question. When embedding a report via C# with the helper class, can you control the frame size and the placement? And the answer is absolutely. If I go back here, just to kind of quickly give you an answer to that, and we look at this particular frame inside here that we're creating. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and take a look at, when I get to the very bottom here, and finally get to this inside there. So notice that you have a style. Now, there is a new modern way that we have styles in terms of VH or view height. So that's 85% of view height. So I want it 75% of view height. Let's go ahead and change that inside there. And if you wanted to use, a pixel, absolute width or height, you could do that as well. So all that, is fairly easy to control inside there. It used to be 85. Now we've got it to 75% of the width height inside there. Okay. Yeah, and that style gets generated in your app.js code. That is correct. Okay, so at this point, I think we've covered all the necessary things. You will get a follow-up email from us, and it will say thank you for attending. It will reiterate the URL to the GitHub repository, and will also include a link to the recording of this session that we will post on YouTube sometime either late this week or over the weekend. Anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed the session today, got some good information. Thank you very much for coming to our webinars and enjoying what we do here. Other than that, thanks to everybody, and hopefully see you in an upcoming webcast.